The first thing I learned after coming back to the shore was that nothing waits for you, no matter how much you wish it did. The sea looked the same, gray and endless, but the town felt tighter, like it had closed its fists around old secrets. I told myself this was only a temporary stay, just long enough to help my wife settle her father's affairs. That was the lie I used to breathe normally. The truth was simpler and harder. I had nowhere else to go without thinking of him. My marriage had already been cracked long before this trip. We spoke politely, carefully, like people sharing a rented space rather than a life. She noticed everything except me. I noticed everything, including how lonely she was, and still I stayed silent. Silence had become our language. Coming back here felt like pressing on a bruise I pretended didn't hurt. I didn't expect to see him so soon. When I did, it wasn't dramatic. No music, no slow motion. Just a familiar voice behind me, saying my name the way it used to, soft but certain. I turned, and there he was, older, sharper around the eyes, but still carrying the same calm that once pulled me in without asking permission. We stood too close for two people who hadn't spoken in years. Too far for two people who once shared everything. He asked why I was back. I gave him this safe answer. Family. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes lingered, searching for the part of me that never learned how to lie properly. He told me he still lived by the water, still worked with boats, still woke before dawn. Every word felt like an invitation I hadn't earned that night. Lying next to my wife, I stared at the ceiling and counted the distance between breaths. I told myself seeing him meant nothing. That old feelings fade if you don't feed them. But memory doesn't ask permission. It arrives fully formed, bringing heat, regret, and want. I remembered how he once held my hand in secret, how being seen by him felt like being named correctly for the first time. The next days were filled with errands, signatures, polite conversations. My wife was distracted, exhausted, grateful for my presence but untouched by it. I watched her move through rooms like a guest in her own grief, and guilt sat heavy in my chest. I was already betraying her in ways that didn't leave marks. When he asked me to walk along the shore, I said yes too quickly. We spoke about small things at first. Weather, work, the town. Then the silence stretched, charged and fragile. He admitted he had wondered if I'd ever come back. I admitted I had thought about him more than I should have. Neither of us said the word infidelity, but it stood between us, unspoken and undeniable. By the time we turned back, I knew I had crossed something invisible but final. Not with my body, not yet, but with my honesty. I was standing on familiar ground, looking at a future I once ran from, while still wearing a ring that promised a different life. And for the first time I understood that wanting wasn't the same as choosing, but it was just as dangerous. The days after that walk blurred into each other, but the feeling didn't fade. It sharpened. I started measuring time by the moments I wasn't with my wife, by the excuses I rehearsed before speaking them out loud. I told myself I was being careful, that nothing had actually happened, but the truth sat quietly underneath every thought. I was already divided. My wife noticed the change before I did. She asked if I was tired, if the stress was getting to me. I said yes because it was easier than explaining the other weight pressing on my chest. She reached for my hand once, squeezing it gently, and the touch felt unfamiliar, like something borrowed. Guilt followed immediately, thick and sour, but it didn't stop me from thinking about him later that night, replaying the sound of his voice, the way he listened as if every word mattered. I began finding reasons to pass by the harbor. Sometimes I didn't even see him. I just stood there watching the water, letting the possibility settle in my bones. When I did see him, it was never planned. Or at least that's what I told myself. A brief conversation. A shared cigarette. A look held for a second too long. Nothing obvious. Everything dangerous. He never pushed. That was the worst part. He spoke to me like someone who already knew the answer and didn't need to ask the question. He talked about his life, the loneliness he didn't dress up with jokes, the relationships that never quite fit. When he said he tried to want differently, his voice didn't break, but something in me did. I recognized that effort. I had lived it at a home. The distance between my wife and me grew quieter, more polite. We slept facing opposite sides of the bed, our backs a careful agreement. She trusted me enough not to question where my thoughts went when I was silent. That trust made everything worse. I wasn't just betraying her body. I was betraying her belief in me. One evening, while she was in the shower, My phone lit up with his name. I didn't answer. I watched it vibrate until the screen went dark, my heart pounding like I'd been caught doing something wrong, even though no one was watching. Later, I told myself I'd done the right thing, that ignoring him was proof of control. But control didn't stop me from wondering what he wanted to say, or from feeling disappointed that he hadn't tried again. The realization came slowly, painfully clear. I wasn't choosing between two people. I was choosing between the version of myself I had built to survive and the one I had buried to be accepted. That knowledge didn't feel noble, felt selfish, because every step toward him was a step away from the life I had promised to protect. When he finally spoke the truth out loud, it wasn't dramatic. He said he could feel me pulling away and closer at the same time. He said it hurt to watch. I wanted to apologize. Instead, I stayed quiet. Silence had always been my weapon and my shield. He told me he wouldn't ask me to leave my wife, that whatever happened had to be something I chose freely. His restraint made the choice heavier, not lighter. That night, lying awake again, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Infidelity doesn't begin with touch. It begins the moment honesty becomes selective. I was already editing myself, already protecting one truth by sacrificing another. And as the sound of the waves drifted through the open window, I knew I was standing at the edge of something irreversible, pretending I hadn't already leaned forward. The turning point didn't arrive like a confession or a kiss. It came disguised as necessity. My wife needed space to breathe through her grief, and I needed a reason to stop thinking. When she suggested I spend the afternoon out while she sorted through old photographs, I agreed too quickly again. I told myself this time would be different. I told myself I was just walking, that I found him where I expected to, hands busy, mind elsewhere. He looked up and smiled like nothing was wrong, like we weren't standing on opposite sides of a line neither of us wanted to name. We talked longer than usual. Not about the past, not about us, but about everything that filled the silence between. Dreams he never followed. The life I chose because it was easier to explain. Each sentence peeled something back, leaving less room to hide. At some point, the conversation stopped being safe. He said my name and followed it with a truth I hadn't prepared for. That he still felt it. That time hadn't softened anything. It had only taught him how to carry it quietly. Hearing it out loud didn't shock me. It settled into me like something I had been holding for years without realizing it had weight. I didn't say it back. Not because it wasn't true, but because saying it would mean accepting what came next. The space between us closed without intention. No sudden movement, no dramatic pull. Just proximity that felt inevitable. When his hand brushed mine, it lingered. That was it. That was the moment. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. I stayed exactly where I was, and somehow that felt worse than either choice. My body had already answered before my mouth could. Guilt arrived late and stayed long. Images of my wife flashed through my mind, her quiet trust, her unguarded sadness. I thought of the vows I repeated without fully understanding them. I thought of how many times I had chosen silence over honesty and called it kindness. Standing there, I realized I had been preparing for this breach long before today. He noticed the change in my face and stepped back first. That restraint cracked something open. He said we should stop. That we were heading somewhere that would leave scars on all of us. I nodded, grateful and angry at the same time. Grateful for the pause. Angry because the pause didn't erase what had already crossed inside me. When I returned home, the air felt heavier. My wife looked up from the table and smiled, asking if the walk helped. I said yes. The lie slid out easily, practiced by now. She reached for me, resting her head against my shoulder, and I froze for half a second before forcing myself to relax. I held her, breathing in her familiar scent, wondering when familiarity had become something I had to remind myself to appreciate. That night, sleep refused me again. I lay awake, replaying the near touch, the unspoken words, the version of myself that felt more alive in restraint than it did in comfort. I understood then that the line had already been crossed, even if no one else could see it. Infidelity wasn't looming anymore. It had settled quietly into my choices, patient, waiting for me to either confront it or let it define me. Morning came with a clarity that felt cruel. Nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything underneath was unstable. My wife moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, making coffee, asking ordinary questions, trusting the rhythm we had built together. I answered her automatically, aware of how practiced I had become at dividing myself. The normalcy pressed against my conscience harder than any accusation could have. I avoided him that day, not out of strength but fear. Fear of how easily the restraint had slipped, how close I had come to making a choice that couldn't be undone. Distance didn't bring relief. It amplified everything. Every sound from the harbor carried the memory of his presence. Every pause in conversation with my wife reminded me of what I wasn't saying in the afternoon. She finally spoke the question I had been waiting for without realizing it. She asked if I was still happy here in this town, in this marriage. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion and something close to resignation. I wanted to confess everything. I wanted to tear open the careful structure we had built and let the truth fall where it may. Instead, I hesitated, and that hesitation became its own answer. She nodded slowly, as if she had already prepared for my silence. She said she felt me drifting. That grief wasn't the only thing pulling us apart. Hearing her name the distance hurt more than any confrontation. It forced me to see myself from the outside. A man clinging to stability while craving honesty elsewhere. I told her I needed time to think. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't enough. That evening, I found him waiting by the shore, not planned, not avoided either. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. We stood side by side, watching the tide move in and out, the rhythm steady and indifferent. I told him I felt split in two. He said he knew. He said loving someone shouldn't require erasing yourself. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. I admitted I was afraid of losing everything. He reminded me that I was already losing pieces of myself. There was no touching this time, no leaning close. Just honesty, raw and unguarded. That felt more intimate than anything else we could have done. For the first time, I didn't feel pulled. I felt seen. When I returned home, my wife was asleep. I sat at the edge of the bed and looked at her, memorizing the familiar lines of her face, the life we had shared, the promises that once felt absolute. I understood then that staying silent was its own form of betrayal. Not just to her, but to myself. I didn't make a final choice that night. Not between her and him. But I made a different decision, quieter and more frightening. I decided that the next day I would stop editing the truth. Whatever followed would hurt, but it would be real. And as the sound of the waves crept through the open window, I realized that sometimes the shore isn't where you arrive. It's where you finally admit you've been standing all along.